Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The security footage from Don Mueang International Airport shows a man walking in circles near Gate 47 at 3:47 in the morning. His movements are slow, methodical, like someone searching for something they've lost but can't quite remember what it was. The timestamp flickers occasionally, brief distortions that the airport technical staff attributed to electrical interference. What the footage doesn't show is the woman who led him there, the one he followed from the coffee kiosk near the departure lounge, the one wearing the flight attendant uniform that didn't match any airline currently operating from the terminal. When airport security found him 6 hours later, he was standing on the tarmac between runways, holding a boarding pass that had been burned along all four edges. The paper blackened and curled inward, like something pulled from a fire. He couldn't remember his name, his destination, or how he'd gotten past 3 separate security checkpoints without triggering a single alarm. Marcus Chen had been traveling through Southeast Asia for 5 months, moving from city to city with nothing more than a backpack and a loose itinerary that changed depending on where he met interesting people or heard about places worth seeing. He was 29. A freelance photographer from Sydney who'd saved for 2 years to take this trip. And by the time he reached Bangkok, he'd grown comfortable with the rhythm of solo travel. The quiet moments in airports and bus stations, the conversations with strangers that lasted an hour and then dissolved into memory. He'd flown into Suvarnabhumi Airport when he first arrived in Thailand, but his departing flight to Phnom Penh was scheduled out of Don Mueang, the older airport on the opposite side of the city. He didn't mind the switch. Some travelers preferred Don Mueang for its smaller size, its fewer crowds, the way it felt less like a shopping mall and more like an actual place of transit. His flight was scheduled for 6:15 in the morning, a budget airline departure that required checking in 3 hours early. Marcus arrived at the airport just after 2. The terminal quiet in that suspended way airports become in the deep hours of night, when most shops are shuttered behind metal grates and the fluorescent lights seem harsher against the emptiness. He moved through check-in quickly, his bag exactly within the weight limit, his documents in order. The woman at the counter barely looked at him as she printed his boarding pass and directed him toward security. He passed through without incident, collected his belongings from the scanning trays, and entered the departure area, where a handful of other passengers sat scattered across rows of connected plastic chairs, most of them dozing with their heads tilted back, or leaning against pillows wedged between their shoulders and the armrests. Marcus found a seat near Gate 42, close enough to the departure screens that he could monitor any changes to his flight status. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through the photos he'd taken over the past week, images of temples and street food vendors, and the Chao Phraya River at dusk. He was debating whether to buy coffee when he noticed the woman standing near the window that overlooked the tarmac. She was wearing a navy blue uniform with gold trim along the collar and sleeves, the kind flight attendants wore, though the cut looked slightly outdated, the skirt a bit longer than current styles. She stood very still, her back to the terminal, her reflection faint in the glass. Marcus thought she might be on break, taking a moment away from passengers and service carts, but something about her stillness caught his attention. She didn't shift her weight, didn't check her phone, didn't move at all except for the slow turn of her head as she seemed to scan the darkness beyond the window. He looked away, focused on his phone again. But when he glanced back a minute later, she had turned around and was walking slowly through the gate area, her eyes moving across the scattered passengers as if searching for someone specific. Marcus went back to scrolling, deleting a few blurry shots, adjusting the exposure on others. He didn't notice when she stopped walking. He didn't notice when she changed direction and started moving toward him. He only looked up when her shadow fell across his lap, a diffuse darkness cast by the overhead lights. She was standing directly in front of him, close enough that he had to tilt his head back to see her face. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with straight black hair pulled into a neat bun and makeup applied with precision, the kind of polished appearance airlines demanded. Her name tag was pinned slightly crooked on her lapel, but Marcus couldn't read the name from his angle. She was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes, which remained fixed and unblinking. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft and carefully measured, the accent crisp but difficult to place. "I need help finding my gate." Marcus blinked, surprised by the request. He glanced around the terminal, noting the departure screens mounted every 20 meters, the illuminated gate numbers clearly visible above each boarding area. "Your gate?" he repeated, uncertain. "Yes," she said, still smiling. "I'm supposed to depart soon, but I can't seem to find where I need to be. Could you help me look?" There was something odd about the way she phrased it, as if finding a gate required searching rather than simply reading signs, but Marcus attributed this to a language barrier or perhaps exhaustion. He'd met plenty of airport staff over the months who worked overnight shifts and moved through their duties in a kind of automated haze. "Sure," he said, standing and slipping his phone into his pocket. "Which gate number?" 47, she said immediately. Marcus turned toward the departure screens, scanning the list of flights and corresponding gates. He saw gates in the 30s, gates in the 50s, but no gate 47 appeared on any of the displays. He frowned, wondering if she'd misheard her assignment. "Are you sure it's 47? He asked. "I don't see it listed." "It's at the end," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the far side of the terminal. "Past the other gates. It's easy to miss." Marcus hesitated. Something felt slightly wrong about this interaction. A instinctive discomfort he couldn't quite identify, but he dismissed it as paranoia brought on by exhaustion and too many early mornings. "Okay," he said. "I'll walk with you." She turned without another word and began walking, her pace unhurried, her posture perfectly straight. Marcus fell into step beside her, then slightly behind when the corridor narrowed. They passed Gate 44, then Gate 45, then Gate 46, each area empty except for a few sleeping passengers slumped in chairs. The overhead lights seemed dimmer this far down the terminal, or perhaps it was just the absence of people that made the space feel darker. Marcus noticed the shops here were not just closed, but looked long abandoned, their window displays empty, their signs faded and coated in a thin film of dust. "Is this area even in use?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding too loud in the silence. The woman didn't answer. She kept walking, her heels clicking against the tile floor in a steady rhythm that seemed to echo longer than it should. Marcus glanced at his phone, checking the time. 3:32. He still had nearly 3 hours before boarding, but he was beginning to regret offering to help. He could turn back now, apologize, and say he needed to return to his own gate, but something kept him following, a strange compulsion he couldn't explain, as if turning away would be ruder than continuing forward into this increasingly strange situation. They reached the end of the terminal, where the corridor opened into a small gate area with rows of empty chairs and a single departure screen that displayed nothing but static. The woman stopped walking and turned to face him. "This is it," she said. Marcus looked around. There was no gate number visible, no boarding desk, no jetway extending toward an aircraft. The windows showed only darkness, the tarmac lights either turned off or malfunctioning. "I don't think this gate is active," he said carefully. "It's always active," she replied, her smile widening slightly. "People just don't see it." The air felt colder here, and Marcus noticed his breath was fogging slightly, which made no sense given the tropical climate and the airport's air conditioning. He took a step backward, his instincts finally overriding his politeness. "I should get back to my gate," he said. "You're already at your gate," the woman said, and her voice had changed, lost its careful softness, and become something flatter, more distant, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Marcus turned to leave, but the corridor behind him had changed. The gates he'd passed on the way here were gone, replaced by blank walls and darkened glass. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then steadied into a dim amber glow that made everything look sepia-toned and unfamiliar. He spun back toward the woman, but she was no longer standing where she'd been. She was sitting in one of the chairs now, her posture still perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Where's your boarding pass?" she asked. Marcus reached into his pocket automatically, pulled out the paper boarding pass the check-in agent had given him. He held it up, uncertain why he was complying, why his hand was shaking. The woman nodded slowly. "Put it on the desk," she said, gesturing toward the empty boarding area. "There's no one there," Marcus said, his voice thin. "Put it on the desk," she repeated, and this time her voice overlapped with itself, as if two people were speaking in near-perfect unison. Marcus walked toward the desk, his legs moving against his will, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body refusing to obey. He placed the boarding pass on the counter and stepped back. The paper immediately began to darken, smoke rising from the edges as the material burned inward without flame, the heat so intense he could feel it from a meter away. Within seconds, the pass was nothing but ash and blackened fragments, the burnt pieces curling upward like flower petals. "Now you can board," the woman said, and when Marcus turned toward her, she was standing directly behind him, so close he could feel the cold radiating from her body like standing near an open freezer. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, his throat constricted, his lungs refusing to draw air. She reached out and touched his forehead with one finger, and everything went white, not bright, but empty. A void of color and sensation that swallowed thought and memory and left nothing but the feeling of falling through space that had no bottom. Airport security found Marcus at 9:20 in the morning, long after his flight had departed. He was standing on the tarmac between runways 2 and 3, an area that should have been impossible to access without triggering multiple alarms and automatic lockdown procedures. He was barefoot, his shoes later found neatly placed beside a service door that led to the restricted airfield area. In his hand was a boarding pass, the paper burned black along every edge, the center just barely legible enough to read his name and flight number. He responded to questions with silence, his eyes unfocused, his breathing shallow. Medical staff transported him to a hospital where doctors found nothing physically wrong except mild dehydration and a core body temperature 2 degrees below normal despite the heat. It took 3 days for Marcus to speak, and when he did, he could only repeat fragments of sentences that made no sense to the hospital psychiatrist assigned to his case. He talked about a woman who worked for an airline that didn't exist, about a gate that wasn't on any terminal map, about following someone through a corridor that kept getting longer no matter how far he walked. He described the feeling of his boarding pass burning in his hand, though his fingers showed no signs of burns or injury. He insisted he could still hear her voice asking him to board, telling him his flight was ready, promising him he'd reach his destination if he just kept walking toward the darkness beyond the windows. The hospital released him after a week, with a referral for ongoing psychiatric care, and a diagnosis of acute stress reaction brought on by exhaustion and possibly substance use, though his blood tests showed nothing unusual. Marcus returned to Australia 2 weeks later, flying out of Suvarnabhumi instead of Don Mueang, refusing to even drive past the older airport. He never traveled alone again, never took another early morning flight, and every boarding pass he received, he immediately photographed and backed up to cloud storage, terrified that it might burst into flames in his pocket and leave him stranded in some liminal space between departure and arrival. He stopped taking pictures altogether, couldn't look at his camera without remembering the last photo he'd taken before he met the woman. A shot of the departure screens at 2:53 in the morning, the timestamp marking the last moment his memory remained completely intact. Airport officials dismissed the incident as a combination of sleepwalking and mental breakdown, though they couldn't explain how Marcus had bypassed security doors that required key cards and biometric scanning, or why footage from 17 different cameras showed nothing but empty corridors during the exact time Marcus claimed to be walking toward Gate 47. The technical staff noted unusual electromagnetic interference in the older wing of the terminal that night, equipment malfunctions that caused temporary blackouts and corrupted video files, but these were attributed to aging infrastructure and scheduled for maintenance that was continually delayed due to budget constraints. Other travelers began reporting similar encounters over the following months. Always solo passengers on late-night flights, always approached by a woman in an outdated flight attendant uniform, always asked to help find a gate that shouldn't exist. Most refused and forgot the encounter within hours, chalking it up to fatigue or confusion. A few followed, and those few were found wandering restricted areas with burnt boarding passes and gaps in their memory that doctors struggled to explain. The airport never issued warnings or acknowledgments, never added signage or increased security in that section of the terminal. Gate 47 remained absent from all official maps and departure screens, but if you walked far enough past the active gates in the early hours before dawn, past the shuttered shops and empty seating areas, you might see her standing near the windows, reflected in the glass, waiting patiently for the next passenger who travels alone and doesn't know better than to offer help to someone who should already know exactly where they need to be. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as disturbing as that encounter was, airports aren't the only places where travelers find themselves trapped between departure and destination. In Vietnam's bustling capital, another kind of transit space holds its own dark secrets. A place where checking in is simple, but leaving becomes impossible. The stories share a common thread: spaces designed for temporary stays that somehow become permanent for those unlucky enough to ignore the warnings whispered by locals who know better than to cross certain thresholds. Sarah Voss had been traveling through Southeast Asia for 3 months, working remotely as a graphic designer and staying in cheap hostels and guest houses that stretched her savings further than any hotel could. She'd learned to spot the red flags, the places with suspiciously low prices that turned out to have bedbugs or aggressive owners, the hostels that looked charming in photos but smelled like mildew and cigarette smoke in reality. By the time she reached Hanoi, she considered herself experienced enough to trust her instincts, to read between the lines of online reviews and make smart choices about where to spend her nights. She'd booked 3 nights at a place called Njak Mai Guest House in the Old Quarter, drawn by reviews that praised its authentic atmosphere and central location. the price low enough to make her budget comfortable for the first time in weeks. She arrived at the guest house just after sunset, wheeling her small suitcase over uneven sidewalks crowded with motorbikes and plastic stools where locals sat drinking bia hoi and eating bowls of steaming pho. The building was narrow, squeezed between a tailor shop and a pharmacy, its facade painted a fading yellow with green shutters that hung slightly crooked on their hinges. A hand-painted sign above the door displayed the guest house name in both Vietnamese and English, the letters chipped and weathered. Sarah pushed open the door, a small bell chiming somewhere in the back, and stepped into a dim lobby that smelled like incense and old wood. The woman behind the desk looked up from her phone, her expression neutral. She was perhaps 60, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her clothes simple and practical. "You have reservation?" she asked in heavily accented English. "Yes, Sarah Voss. 3 nights," Sarah replied, setting her backpack on the floor. The woman nodded and pulled out a ledger, the kind with columns drawn by hand and names written in blue ink. No computer in sight. She flipped through pages until she found Sarah's name, written in careful capital letters. "Room 3C, she said, pulling a key from a board on the wall behind her. "3rd floor, end of hall. Breakfast 7 to 9, ground floor." Sarah took the key, an actual metal key attached to a wooden tag with the room number burned into the surface. "Is there an elevator?" she asked, eyeing the narrow staircase visible through a doorway to the left. "No elevator," the woman said, already looking back at her phone. "Only stairs." Sarah hefted her suitcase and began climbing, the wooden steps creaking under her. Wait. The stairwell barely wide enough for her and her luggage. The walls were painted a dark green that made the space feel even more confined, and the single light bulb on each landing cast more shadows than illumination. She passed the 2nd floor, where she could hear a television playing Vietnamese, dubbed over what sounded like a Korean drama, and continued to the 3rd floor, which was quieter, almost silent, except for the sound of her own breathing. Room 3C was at the far end of the hallway, exactly as the woman had said. Sarah unlocked the door and stepped inside, reaching for the light switch by touch. The fluorescent ceiling light flickered twice before steadying, revealing a small room with a double bed pushed against one wall, a wooden wardrobe, a small desk and chair, and a bathroom visible through an open doorway. The walls were painted white, but had yellowed with age, and the floor was covered in worn linoleum that might have once been patterned, but was now mostly faded to a uniform gray. A window looked out over the alley, covered by thin curtains that moved slightly in the breeze from the air conditioning unit mounted above the bed. Sarah dropped her bags and sat on the bed, testing the firmness. It was acceptable, better than some places she'd stayed, the sheets clean if slightly rough from repeated washing. She pulled out her phone and connected to the Wi-Fi, the password written on a small card on the desk. The connection was slow, but functional. She scrolled through her messages, responded to a few work emails, and ordered food delivery from a nearby restaurant, too tired to go back out into the chaos of the old quarter streets. Dinner arrived 40 minutes later, and Sarah ate on the bed while watching downloaded episodes of a show she'd been following. She finished around 10, brushed her teeth, changed into sleep clothes, and climbed under the thin blanket. The room was cold from the air conditioning, almost too cold, but she was grateful after weeks of staying in places where fans did little more than push hot air around. She set an alarm for 8, planning to explore the city the next day, and closed her eyes. She woke to the sound of the door opening, the hinges creaking slowly, the latch clicking as it disengaged. Sarah sat up immediately, her heart racing, reaching for her phone on the nightstand. The screen showed 3:17. The room was dark, the curtains blocking most of the streetlight from the alley. She could see the door standing open, a wedge of slightly less dark hallway visible beyond it, but no one standing in the doorway, no shadow moving in the corridor. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice rough with sleep. No response. The door remained open, motionless, as if waiting. Sarah grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. Everything was as she'd left it, her bags on the floor, the desk empty except for the Wi-Fi card and a small notepad. She got out of bed slowly, keeping the light pointed toward the door, and walked across the room. The hallway beyond was empty, the doors to the other rooms closed, no sound of movement anywhere. Sarah stepped into the hallway and looked both ways. Nothing. She went back into her room, closed the door firmly, and tested the lock. It engaged with a solid click, the mechanism seemingly functional. She checked the door frame for damage or warping that might cause it to swing open on its own, but found nothing obvious. She attributed it to an old building settling, a lock that didn't quite catch properly, and returned to bed, though sleep came more slowly this time. The door opened again at 3:17 the next morning, the exact same time, the same slow creak of hinges and click of disengaging latch. Sarah was awake within seconds, sitting up and staring at the open door. This time she didn't call out, just watched and waited. The door remained open for approximately 5 minutes. She timed it on her phone, then slowly swung closed on its own, the latch clicking back into place with a sound that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. Sarah turned on the bedside lamp and examined the door more carefully. She locked it, tried to force it open from inside, tested whether vibrations or air pressure might cause it to unlatch. Nothing she did could replicate the behavior. The lock was simple but secure, requiring the handle to be turned with deliberate force to open. She wedged the desk chair under the handle, a trick she'd learned from other solo travelers, and went back to bed with the lamp still on. The door didn't open again that night, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had tried, that pressure had built against the chair wedged under the handle, tested, and found the obstacle and retreated. She packed up at first light, skipping breakfast, and went downstairs to ask about changing rooms. The same woman was behind the desk, sipping tea from a small cup. "My door keeps opening," Sarah said. "I'd like to move to a different room." The woman's expression didn't change. "All rooms occupied," she said. "I didn't see anyone else on my floor," Sarah countered. "All rooms occupied," the woman repeated, as if Sarah hadn't spoken. Sarah felt a flicker of irritation but suppressed it. "The lock is broken. Can you at least fix it?" "Lock is fine," the woman said, looking back down at her phone. "Many guests stay in 3C. No complaints." "I'm complaining right now," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. The woman finally looked up, her eyes meeting Sarah's for the first time. "You want different room? You check out. Find different hotel." Sarah considered this. She'd paid for 3 nights up front, non-refundable according to the booking site. But at this point, she'd rather lose the money than spend another night in a room where the door had a mind of its own. "Fine," she said. "I'll check out." "Checkout is at noon," the woman said. "It's 8 in the morning. I want to check out now." "Come back at noon." Sarah stared at her, confused by the arbitrary insistence on a time that was 4 hours away. "I'm ready to leave now. I'll just pack up and go." The woman shook her head slowly. "Room 3C checkout is at noon. Come back then." There was something in the way she said it, a finality that felt less like policy and more like warning. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, then closed it, deciding she'd rather wait 4 hours than continue this circular conversation. She left the guest house and spent the morning walking through the old quarter, stopping for coffee and banh mi, killing time by browsing shops she had no intention of buying from. The morning felt normal, the city vibrant and chaotic in the way she'd come to appreciate, but an edge of unease followed her through every street. She returned to the guest house at 11:45, wanting to be ready the moment noon arrived. The lobby was empty, no one behind the desk. Sarah called out, but received no response. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, unlocked her door, and began packing quickly, shoving clothes into her bag without bothering to fold them. She was nearly finished when she noticed something on the desk that hadn't been there before, a piece of paper folded in half. Sarah picked it up and unfolded it. The message was handwritten in Vietnamese, the script neat and precise. She pulled out her phone and used a translation app, holding the camera over the text. The translation came back fragmented, but clear enough to understand the meaning. Those who stay in room 3C are welcome to remain as long as they wish. The door will always open for them. Sarah dropped the paper and grabbed her bags, no longer caring about organization or forgotten items. She rushed into the hallway and toward the stairs, but stopped when she saw the woman standing at the top of the staircase, blocking the way down. She was holding a small tray with a cup of tea, as if delivering room service. "It's noon," the woman said. "You can check out now." "I need to get past you," Sarah said, her voice tight. The woman didn't move. "Room 3C is special," she said, her English suddenly clearer, the accent less pronounced. "Not many foreigners understand. Building used to be morgue, long time ago, during war. Bodies kept on 3rd floor, end of hall. Room 3C was storage, where they wait before burial." Sarah's grip tightened on her bag straps. "I don't care about the history. I just want to leave." "Some guests never leave," the woman continued, as if Sarah hadn't spoken. "They check in, they stay in 3C, and they become part of the building. We find them in the morning, still in bed, cold, no marks, no struggle. Just stop breathing, sometimes during night, sometimes at dawn, but always in 3C. "You're insane," Sarah said, taking a step back. "This is illegal. You can't trap people here." "No trap," the woman said, and for the first time, something like sadness crossed her face. "Door opens at 3:17 every night. That's when they come to check on room, make sure everyone is still there. If door opens and you're still inside, they think you want to stay. If you leave before 3:17, no problem. But you stayed 2 nights now. Door opened twice. They think you belong here now." Sarah turned and ran toward the window at the end of the hall, the one that overlooked the alley. She could climb down the exterior, find a drain pipe or ledge. Anything was better than staying in this building another second. But when she reached the window and pulled aside the curtains, she saw that it wasn't a window at all, just a frame set into the wall, with glass painted black on the inside to mimic the appearance of looking outside. The air conditioning unit she'd thought was in her room didn't exist. The sounds of the alley she'd heard had been coming from somewhere else, piped in through speakers or traveling through the old building's walls. She spun back toward the woman, but the hallway was empty now, the top of the stairs clear. Sarah ran down, taking the steps 2 at a time, hitting the 2nd floor landing and continuing down toward the ground floor. The lobby was dark, the front door closed. She grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't budge, locked from the outside, the mechanism requiring a key she didn't have. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the street beyond remained oblivious, the noise of motorbikes and vendors drowning out her voice. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and measured, more than one set descending in perfect unison. She didn't turn around. didn't want to see who or what was coming down from the third floor. She searched the lobby for another exit, found a narrow hallway leading toward the back of the building. She ran down it, past a small kitchen and a room filled with cleaning supplies, until she reached a door that opened onto an interior courtyard. The courtyard was tiny, barely 3 meters across, surrounded on all sides by the backs of adjacent buildings. There was no exit, no gate leading to the street, just walls, and a small square of sky visible far above. In the center of the courtyard sat a stone bench, and on the bench were items left by previous guests: a backpack, a pair of sandals, a journal with entries written in German, a smartphone with a cracked screen. Sarah recognized the items from online reviews she'd read, previous travelers who'd stayed at the guest house and never posted updates after checking in, their accounts going silent mid-trip. The footsteps behind her grew closer, emerging from the hallway into the courtyard. Sarah turned and saw them, 3 figures in white clothing, their faces obscured by surgical masks of the kind worn in morgues, their eyes empty and unfocused. They moved with the slow precision of people who had nothing but time, who'd performed the same task countless times before and would continue performing it long after Sarah was gone. She pressed herself against the far wall, her mind racing through options and finding none that ended with escape. The figures surrounded her, reaching out with hands that were cold when they touched her arms, her shoulders, guiding her gently but firmly back toward the building. She tried to fight, to pull away, but her strength seemed to drain with each step, replaced by a heaviness that made her limbs feel weighted and clumsy. They led her back through the hallway, up the stairs, past the 2nd floor, to the 3rd floor and down the corridor to room 3C. The door stood open, waiting. They guided her inside and released her, stepping back into the hallway. Sarah turned to run past them, but her legs wouldn't respond, her body moving on its own toward the bed where she sat down heavily, her bag slipping from her grip and landing on the floor. The figures watched from the doorway for a moment, then one of them reached out and slowly pulled the door closed. The latch clicked into place with a sound of absolute finality. Sarah sat on the bed as the room grew colder, the air conditioning that didn't exist somehow making the temperature drop until she could see her breath. She tried to stand, but couldn't. Tried to scream, but no sound emerged. Her phone lay on the floor where it had fallen from her pocket, the screen showing the time. 3:16. She watched the numbers change to 3:17, and the door opened slowly, hinges creaking, and she understood with perfect clarity that this was how it would be from now on, every night at 3:17, the door opening to check on her, to verify she was still here, still part of the room that never let its guests check out. 2 days later, the cleaning staff found Sarah Voss sitting on the bed in room 3C, her eyes open but unseeing, her body cold to the touch, no pulse, no breath, no explanation for what had stopped her heart. The coroner attributed it to sudden cardiac arrest, possibly brought on by an undiagnosed condition or extreme stress. Her belongings were collected and shipped back to her family in Germany, who couldn't understand why their daughter had chosen to stay in such a cheap guest house when she had money in her account for better accommodations. The guest house owner, when questioned by police conducting a routine investigation, expressed appropriate sadness at the tragedy, but insisted the room was perfectly safe, that many guests had stayed there without incident, that sometimes travelers just suffered medical emergencies far from home. The police found no evidence of foul play, no reason to pursue the matter further. The room was cleaned and prepared for the next guest, who would check in attracted by low prices and authentic atmosphere, who would ignore the handful of reviews, mentioning strange noises and doors that opened by themselves, who would tell themselves that bad things only happen to other people, never to travelers careful enough to trust their instincts and smart enough to recognize danger. But instincts only work when the danger makes itself known, when there are signs to read and warnings to heed. Room 3C at Nizok Mai Guest House doesn't advertise its history, doesn't post warnings or disclose the deaths that have occurred within its walls. It simply exists, waiting patiently for the next solo traveler looking for a cheap place to sleep, someone who won't be missed for a few days, someone who might book 3 nights without realizing they're actually committing to something far more permanent than a short stay in Vietnam's bustling capital. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And yet, as terrifying as these stories are, they represent only a fraction of the darkness that travelers encounter across Asia. What happens when the very places meant to offer rest and safety become prisons from which there is no escape? In the next story, we venture even deeper into the unknown, where the line between the living and what comes after grows thinner with each passing moment, and where the only constant is the certainty that some destinations should never be reached. The railway conductor found 23 passengers on the platform at Kanazawa Station when the train finally arrived at 6:42 in the morning, 3 hours behind schedule. He'd counted 41 passengers when they departed Kyoto the previous night at 11:15. The missing 18 were never found, their luggage still in the overhead compartments, their phones and wallets left behind on seats and in restroom stalls, their tickets showing clear evidence of having been scanned at the departure gate. Railway officials investigated for 6 weeks, reviewing security footage and interviewing the passengers who completed the journey. But the footage showed only empty corridors, and the passengers who remained could only offer fragmented memories of the night, confused recollections about fog and reflections, and the feeling that the train had traveled the same stretch of track multiple times without ever actually moving forward. The official report attributed the disappearances to mass hysteria or coordinated departure at an unmapped stop, but locals who lived along the route knew better. They'd heard the stories for decades, whispered warnings about the night train that sometimes forgets how to reach its destination, that circles through darkness until dawn forces it back to the real world, and by then, some of those who started the journey have simply ceased to exist anywhere the living can follow. David Reyes had been teaching English in Osaka for 2 years, a career break that had evolved from a temporary adventure into something more permanent. He'd grown comfortable in Japan, learned enough language to navigate daily life, made friends among other expatriates and a few locals who tolerated his still imperfect Japanese with patient amusement. He traveled extensively throughout Kansai, but had never ventured as far north as Kanazawa, a city known for its preserved geisha districts and traditional gardens. When a 3-day weekend appeared on his school calendar, he booked a ticket on the scenic night train that departed Kyoto late evening and arrived early morning, a journey that would let him sleep through the transit and wake up ready to explore. He arrived at Kyoto Station 40 minutes before departure, the platform crowded with a mix of tourists and locals, families saying goodbye to university students, couples hauling overstuffed suitcases toward the bullet train platforms. The night train to Kanazawa occupied a quieter section of the station, track 7, where the platform was narrower and the lighting somehow dimmer, despite being the same fluorescent fixtures used throughout the building. David found his train car easily, a sleeper configuration with small private compartments lining one side and open seating on the other. He'd opted for the cheaper open seating, a decision he'd made to save money, but now regretted as he saw how cramped the seats looked, how little space existed between rows. He found his assigned seat, 14B, window side, and stored his small backpack in the overhead compartment. The seats around him filled slowly, mostly solo travelers like himself, a few pairs speaking in hushed tones. Directly across the aisle sat a young woman reading a manga, her face obscured by straight black hair that fell forward as she leaned over the pages. 2 rows ahead, an elderly man in a business suit was already asleep, his head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle. Behind David, someone was eating rice crackers from a bag that crinkled with each movement, the sound irritating in the quiet car. The departure announcement played over the speakers, first in Japanese, then in English, welcoming passengers aboard the 11:15 service to Kanazawa with intermediate stops at stations David didn't recognize. The train began moving with barely perceptible momentum, sliding out of Kyoto Station into the night with the smooth efficiency Japanese railways were known for. David watched the city lights thin and disappear as they entered the countryside, the windows reflecting the interior of the train car more clearly as the darkness outside deepened. He tried to sleep but found it difficult despite his exhaustion. The seat reclined only slightly, and every time he began to drift off, the train would sway around a curve or someone would walk down the aisle toward the restroom, their footsteps heavy enough to vibrate through the floor. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through social media, watching videos with the sound off, trying to bore himself into unconsciousness. The train continued north through the Fiver. Darkness. The rhythm of wheels on track, becoming a background hum that should have been soothing, but instead felt vaguely unsettling in a way David couldn't quite identify. Around midnight, he noticed the fog. It appeared gradually, wisps at first visible in the weak light that spilled from the train windows, then thickening into a dense wall that pressed against the glass like something trying to get inside. David had never seen fog this thick, couldn't imagine what weather conditions would create it in the mountains between Kyoto and Kanazawa. He looked around the car to see if other passengers had noticed, but most were asleep or absorbed in their phones, seemingly unbothered by the white void that had swallowed the world beyond the windows. The train began to slow, not the gradual deceleration of approaching a station, but a lurching reduction in speed that made several passengers look up with expressions of mild concern. The PA system crackled, but no announcement followed, just dead air and static. The train slowed further, almost to a stop, then suddenly accelerated again, the motion jerky and unnatural compared to the smooth departure from Kyoto. David felt his stomach drop as the train seemed to tilt slightly, as if the tracks had shifted beneath them, but the sensation passed quickly and the train resumed its normal rhythm. He looked out the window again and saw something that made him lean closer to the glass, uncertain if he was seeing correctly. Through the fog, barely visible, he could make out the lights of another train moving parallel to theirs, close enough that he could see figures inside the other cars, passengers sitting in seats identical to his own. For a moment he thought they were passing another train heading in the opposite direction, but the other train was moving at the same speed, maintaining perfect parallel alignment. David watched as the other train gradually moved ahead, and as it passed, he saw, with perfect clarity, a man sitting in the window seat of the other train's car 14, row B, a man who looked exactly like him, wearing the same jacket, the same expression of confused curiosity. The other David raised his hand in a slow wave, the gesture deliberate and somehow sad, like saying goodbye to someone leaving on a long journey. David jerked back from the window, his heart racing, telling himself it was a trick of reflection, the glass creating a mirror image distorted by the fog and darkness. But when he looked again, the other train was gone, swallowed by the fog, and his own reflection in the window showed only his pale face staring back with wide eyes. "Did you see that?" David asked, turning to the woman across the aisle. She looked up from her manga, her expression blank. "See what?" she asked in accented English. "The other train," David said, pointing toward the window. "There was another train right beside us. I saw someone who looked like me." The woman glanced at the window, then back to David. "Only fog," she said, and returned to her manga, clearly uninterested in continuing the conversation. David turned to the person behind him, the one who'd been eating rice crackers, but that seat was empty now, the bag of crackers sitting abandoned on the cushion. He stood up and looked around the car more carefully. Several seats that had been occupied when they left Kyoto were now empty. Passengers simply gone, with no indication of where they might have gone. The elderly businessman was still asleep 2 rows ahead, but the couple who'd been sitting beside him had vanished. David walked toward the front of the car, intending to find the conductor and ask what was happening, why the train had slowed, where the missing passengers had gone. He passed through the automatic door into the space between cars, the coupling mechanism that allowed movement from one car to the next. The space was cold, despite being enclosed, and through the small windows in the side doors he could see nothing but fog pressing against the glass. He continued into the next car, another sleeper configuration, but this one was completely empty, every seat vacant, the overhead lights flickering intermittently in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. The PA system crackled again, and this time a voice emerged, distorted and layered, as if multiple people were speaking slightly out of sync. "Passengers are advised to remain seated. Do not look out the windows. We will be arriving at our destination shortly." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He turned back toward his original car, walking faster now, his breath visible in small puffs of condensation. When he pushed through the door back into car 14, he saw that more seats had emptied. The woman with the manga was gone, her book lying open on the seat, the pages filled with illustrations of ghosts and spirits, a horror manga he now noticed for the first time. The elderly businessman was still there, but as David passed him, he saw that the man's eyes were open, staring straight ahead with an expression of absolute terror, his mouth slightly agape as if frozen mid-scream. David reached his seat and sat down quickly, his hands shaking. He pulled out his phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal, not even the usual single bar he could usually maintain, even in rural areas. The battery indicator showed full charge, but the time display was wrong, showing 11:53, as if the last 40 minutes had never happened. He looked at his watch, the analog hands pointing to 12:37. But even as he watched, the second hand began moving backward, ticking counterclockwise with steady precision. The train began to slow again, that same lurching deceleration, and through the window David saw lights appearing through the fog, the familiar configuration of a station platform. He felt relief flood through him, certain they were finally arriving somewhere, that he could get off and find answers, or at least escape this increasingly nightmarish journey. But as the train came to a complete stop and the doors opened with their characteristic hiss, David saw the platform sign, and his relief turned to ice in his chest. The sign read, "Kyoto Station, Platform 7, the same platform they'd departed from over an hour ago. Passengers began boarding, different people than before, but moving with the same casual purpose, finding seats and storing luggage as if this were a normal departure. David stood and moved toward the door, intending to get off before the doors closed, but his legs wouldn't cooperate, his body refusing to move toward the exit even as his mind screamed at him to run. He watched helplessly as new passengers filed past him, filling the empty seats, and through the window he saw other passengers walking on the platform, going about their evening as if nothing were wrong. He saw himself standing on the platform, the other David from the parallel train, standing perfectly still and staring directly at the window where David stood trapped inside the train. The other David raised his hand again, that same slow wave goodbye, and his lips moved, forming words David somehow understood, despite the distance and the glass between them. You looked out the window. The doors closed with a definitive sound, and the train began moving again, sliding out of Kyoto Station for what David now realized was the second time. He stumbled back to his seat and sat down heavily, his mind refusing to process what was happening, rejecting the evidence of his senses in favor of rationalization that grew thinner with each impossible moment. Around him, the new passengers settled into their seats, pulled out phones and books, closed their eyes to sleep, completely unaware that they were starting a journey that had no end, that would loop through the same hours of darkness until something unknown decided to release them or claim them entirely. The fog returned as they left the city, thicker than before, and in its depths David began to see shapes, figures standing beside the tracks, watching the train pass. They were people, or had been once, their forms translucent and flickering like poor television reception. Some stood alone, others in groups, all of them perfectly still except for their hands which rose in unison to wave at the passing train. The same goodbye gesture David had seen twice now, the same acknowledgement of departure to somewhere the living couldn't follow. The woman who'd been reading manga reappeared in her seat, as if she'd never left, the book open to the same page. David leaned across the aisle toward her. "We were just in Kyoto," he said, his voice urgent. "We left and we came back, and now we're leaving again. Do you understand? We're stuck in some kind of loop." She looked at him with an expression of profound sadness. "I know," she said quietly. "This is my 4th time. Each loop, fewer people stay. The train is deciding who belongs where." "What does that mean?" David demanded. "How do we get off?" "We don't," she said. "We look out the window because we can't help ourselves, because our curiosity is stronger than our sense of preservation. And when we look, we see what's outside, and once you've seen it, it sees you too. Then it's just a matter of time." "Time until what?" She didn't answer, just returned to her manga, and David realized she was reading the same page over and over. Her eyes not actually processing the images, just moving across panels she'd memorized through endless repetition. He looked around the car and saw that the elderly businessman was gone now, his seat empty, and several other passengers had vanished as well, their abandoned belongings the only evidence they'd ever been there. The train continued through the night, through fog that never thinned, past stations that were sometimes Kyoto and sometimes places David didn't recognize, platforms where no one waited and no one boarded, except occasionally figures that weren't quite solid, that brought cold air and the smell of earth with them when they sat down. David stopped trying to keep track of time, stopped looking at his phone or watch, both of which showed increasingly impossible readings. He sat with his eyes closed, telling himself that if he didn't look out the window, if he didn't see whatever was outside waiting for acknowledgement, he might survive until dawn, when the train would have to return to reality and complete its journey. But eventually, inevitably, he looked. He couldn't help himself. The human need to understand overpowering every instinct of self-preservation. He opened his eyes and turned toward the window and saw them, hundreds of them now, lined up along the tracks in perfect rows, all of them facing the train, all of them waving goodbye with slow, synchronized movements. They had faces he recognized, passengers who disappeared from the car throughout the process. Night. And as he watched, one of them stepped forward and pressed against the window, a young man in a backpack who David had seen sleeping 3 rows back when they'd first departed. The man's face was gray, and his eyes were clouded white, and he mouthed the same words the other David had spoken. You looked out the window. The glass fogged where the man's breath would have been if he'd been alive, and in the condensation, words appeared written by an invisible finger. Welcome home. David tried to scream, but no sound emerged, his throat constricted by terror so absolute it paralyzed every voluntary muscle. The figure outside smiled, revealing teeth that were too numerous and too sharp, and then stepped backward into the fog and disappeared. The train lurched again, that same violent deceleration, and this time when it stopped, David saw through the window that they were on a platform he didn't recognize, somewhere that wasn't marked on any map or timetable. The doors opened, and the PA system spoke again, that layered voice of multiple speakers. Kanazawa Station, final stop. Please exit the train, and do not leave any belongings behind. David stood on legs that barely supported his weight and moved toward the door with the few remaining passengers, perhaps 15 people total from the 41 who'd started the journey. They stepped onto the platform, and David saw the station sign confirming they were indeed in Kanazawa. But something was wrong with the light, the quality of it too flat and gray. The sky above visible through the station's glass roof, showing a color that wasn't quite dawn or dusk, or any natural time of day. The other passengers moved toward the exit with mechanical purpose, their faces blank, and David followed because he didn't know what else to do. Railway officials found them hours later, standing in the station's main hall, all of them staring at nothing, responding to questions with silence or fragmented answers that made no sense. Medical. Staff transported them to a hospital where doctors found nothing physically wrong, except that all of them had core body temperatures 2 degrees below normal, and none of them could explain where the other 23 passengers had gone, or why the train had arrived 3 hours late, or what had happened during the journey through the mountains between Kyoto and Kanazawa. David flew back to Osaka 2 days later, unable to face another train journey, and handed in his resignation at the school the following week. He returned to the United States, where he tried to resume normal life, but found himself unable to take any form of public transportation, unable to look out windows after dark, unable to shake the certainty that somewhere in the fog between destinations there was a train still running its route, still collecting passengers who looked out windows at the wrong moment and saw what waited for them beyond the glass. He keeps his curtains drawn at night and sleeps with the lights on, and never, under any circumstances, travels alone after sunset, because he knows now that some journeys aren't meant to reach their destinations, that some trains exist only to separate the curious from the cautious, and once you've seen your own reflection wave goodbye, you spend the rest of your life wondering if you're really the one who made it back, or just another echo of someone who disappeared into the fog and never truly returned. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.